Hello. On behalf of the Mountain Plains Regional Disaster Health Response System, I'd like to welcome you to this first in a series of presentations from the BNICE program on weapons of mass destruction. My name is Dr. Peter Pons. I am an emergency physician in Denver, Colorado. This first module is an introduction and an overview of the topic. The entire program consists of 9 modules that are narrated, each of which is approximately 20 to 30 minutes in length. And the topics that we're going to cover are those that you see presented on the screen here. The materials that this program was developed from came from a wide variety of sources and individuals, all of whom I thank. And frankly, we borrowed unabashedly from all of these folks. The BNICE acronym affectionately refers to these topics: biologic agents, nuclear materials, incendiaries, chemical agents, and explosives, hence the acronym BNICE. The goal overall is to have healthcare responders, and frankly, responders of all types, to recognize that a WMD incident has occurred, to initiate the correct response, to identify what that potential agent is based on the signs and symptoms of the exposure that's presenting to them, and then begin the appropriate initial actions to treat these individuals. And while doing that, taking the appropriate steps to protect themselves from that agent. Why is this so important? Well, quite frankly, the terrorist threat is a real threat. And it doesn't matter where you live, what community you're from, the potential for one of these incidents is very real. Should one of these agents be used, obviously, the potential to create a lot of casualties and victims is there. And the sad reality is it's not just terrorism. Many of these same chemicals are on our streets and railways every day, going down our highways, and we have to deal with emerging infectious diseases. And dealing with a terrorist bioagent or an infectious disease, quite frankly, is about the same. As a result, every responder of every type needs to be prepared, whether you're a pre-hospital responder or a hospital responder. This saying was written a number of centuries ago. Sun Tzu, the famous Chinese general, said the goal was to kill one, but frighten 10,000. And frankly, that has been a reality when it comes to terrorism. If you think about some of the recent events that have happened, kill 1 or 2 people, the impact on society and the changes that are implemented are huge. What are the objectives of terrorism? Well, there's a whole host of them. Destroy infrastructure, inflict mass casualties, create psychological impairment, erode faith in government's ability to protect us from terrorists, and probably a host of others not listed on the slide. Okay, why the BNICE agents? Well, number one is they are available. Many of these agents, particularly the chemical agents, are out there. They are easy to obtain. Some of them are relatively easy to manufacture. Depending on the target that you choose, you don't need a lot of a particular agent to create a lot of casualties. Some of these agents, the incident may be difficult to recognize initially. The release of a biologic agent or a radiologic agent, both of those take time for their clinical effects to become manifest. So it's not an immediate effect. Some of them are very easy to spread over large areas, thus exposing a large number of people to it. The psychological impact in many cases is even larger than the actual clinical impact. And obviously, existing resources can be overwhelmed. Now, there are some limitations to these BNICE agents. Number one is to effectively disseminate them can be difficult. And in the dissemination process, for instance, the agent may well be destroyed as opposed to be effectively disseminated. Delayed effects. Because some of these agents take time for their manifestations to become evident, frankly, it's not as impressive an event as exploding a bomb, let's say. Obviously, if a terrorist does one of these things, can be counterproductive to their support. They get lots of people looking for them, um, angry, and so governments go after them. Obviously, appropriate use of these has to be very carefully done because they are hazardous, not just to the target, but to the terrorists themselves. And they have to be reasonably skilled in using it and if they are developing it in actually creating the agent that they're using. This graphic demonstrates the various types of weapons of mass destruction, the likelihood of their use, and the potential impact. The impact is the vertical axis, the likelihood of use is the horizontal axis. If you look at nuclear weapon, obviously, the likelihood of a nuclear weapon, formal nuclear weapon being used is relatively small. But were it to be used, the impact would be huge. As we look at radioactive material and the dissemination of just a simple radioactive material, it's a little more likely, but the impact is less. But when we start looking at the chemical agents or the biologic agents, these both relatively easily manufactured, some of them easily available through industry, et cetera. The likelihood increases significantly. And depending on the agent chosen, the impact also is significant. Well, when we look at the time frame for this various agents and how long it takes for their effects to become apparent, if we look at the last two on the list, explosives, incendiaries, and chemical devices, those are immediate. If you release a chemical agent, for the most part, the impact is going to be immediate. Obviously, if you detonate an explosion, the impact is immediate. Radiologic agents, on the other hand, and biologic agents both require time for their clinical effects to become apparent. So the impact takes longer. Now, we like to think terrorism is a relatively new phenomenon. It isn't. This is a graphic that shows some terrorist events from 1970 to 1997. And you can see that, in fact, there's been a number of them using a variety of agents, infectious disease agents, biologics, chemical agents, radiologic agents have all been attempted with varying degrees of success. And we'll talk about some of these. These are events here in the US, beginning essentially with the attacks in 2001. And you can see that the number of actual uses has stayed relatively the same. But after 2001 and the terrorist attacks here in the US, the number of threats, hoaxes, etc., increased dramatically. If we look at non-hoax events, actual events, you can see that you name the WMD, its potential use has been attempted. If we look, however, at terrorist attacks worldwide and the various methods of attacking, you can see that blue line that's demonstrated there are bombings and explosions. And that remains a favorite of terrorists, again, primarily because explosive materials are relatively easily obtained. And, you know, it's not that tough to create some of these devices. If you look at the web, there are a host of websites that provide detailed instructions on how to create devices. This slide talks about just one of those, Aum called The Invention or the Initiative. This was the instructions for how to develop a cyanide chemical dispersal weapon. And not only does it give you step-by-step instructions, but they provide a list of suggested targets. Interestingly, notice that hospitals are one of the suggested targets on their list. And then a variety of other less elaborate ways of creating casualties, parking lot bombs, ambushes, forest fires have been suggested as ways to create casualties and for costing a significant amount of dollar damage. Now, we talk about terrorists, of course, at great length and formal organizations, but the reality is there are a host of both individuals as well as organizations that are involved in these activities. Groups that threaten include the lone individuals, folks like Timothy McVeigh, non-aligned terrorists, cults, groups, state sponsors, insurgents, and other rebels. And you see some of those potential characters on this slide. Aum Shinrikyo, one of the more active cults in Japan, they worked very hard to try and create casualties. They did a number of sarin attacks. They tried a VX nerve agent attack. They tried releasing botulinum toxin a number of times. They got their hands on anthrax and released that multiple times. It turns out that the strain they got was not particularly virulent. And perhaps even most concerning is they attempted to obtain Ebola virus so they could release that. In the US, obviously, you will no doubt recall we had a number of incidents. One of the more notable ones was the anthrax attack. A number of letters were sent both to news personnel and senators that contained very well prepared, highly weaponized anthrax spores that created a number of casualties. And we'll talk about that in more detail in another module. If we look at terrorist groups, these are sort of the top 5 and have been fairly consistent in their ranking. The Islamic State, ISIS, the Taliban, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and the Maoist Communist Party of India. These are the top 5. If you want to do a count of all the identified terrorist groups, it's approximately 160 of them. So as you prepare, one of the things that you should think about is, what are the potential targets in my community? How could someone attack some of these potential targets? And as you look at these photographs on this slide, and the slide asks, what are the potential targets in this area? The simple answer is all of them are potential targets. And we need to be prepared in each of our communities. So these potential targets include enclosed spaces, large crowd and high-profile events, critical facilities and infrastructure, that includes government facilities, facilities with significant hazard and damage potential. For instance, are there chemical materials that are rolling down your highways, being stored in facilities in your community? Or do you have railroads that are carrying a lot of these really very toxic materials in rail cars? And this is just a small list. Where is this stuff located? Well, home production, for example, Aum Shinrikyo, the cult in Japan, produced a lot of the stuff that they tried to release. Laboratory, commercial production, and industrial facilities use a lot of these very potentially dangerous chemicals. Military sources, medical university research facilities have a lot of chemicals. They utilize a lot of radiologic materials, and they are not particularly well protected. And then obviously nuclear facilities have a source of radiologics. So what are the fallacies? Number one is it can't happen to us. It'll happen in the big cities. It'll happen in New York. It'll happen in Chicago. It'll happen in Washington. Excuse me. But it won't happen to us because we live in a small town. Well, unfortunately, that's not true. BNICE agents are so deadly, the victims will all die anyway. Clearly not true. In fact, if you can recognize that an agent has been released, if you can recognize the clinical presentation of that patient and the type of agent that's been used, in fact, there's a lot that you can do to manage one of these events. Well, what's the goal of a terrorist? The goal is to disperse this agent over a large area. And typically the agent will be either a wet or a dry agent and dispersed as an aerosol. Lots of ways this can be done. Letters and packages, very well done with the anthrax attacks. Insects and animals, common method of disseminating disease. And in fact, during World War II, the Japanese tried disseminating infected insects. Contaminated clothing. If you remember during the French and Indian War, contaminated blankets with smallpox were given to the Indians and really decimated their population. Contaminated food and contaminated water. Both of these methods of dissemination of, in particular, biologics have been attempted in various attacks. Another way of doing this is a breaking device, a point source. You could take a light bulb, very carefully unscrew the base, fill it with your chemical, fill it with your biologic agent, and then choosing a target, let's say in a subway system, toss the light bulb, break it, and have it disseminated. This is actually similar to what Aum Shinrikyo did in Tokyo, where they used plastic bags filled with sarin, which they placed in the subway cars and then punctured it with an umbrella, disseminating the sarin. And obviously, once you do that, if there's a little bit of wind, this poses a mild to moderate downwind hazard. Bursting and exploding devices are another method, particularly one agent that would be used in this would be a radiologic, in which a radiologic agent is attached to an explosive. It's detonated and spread over a larger area. This represents a moderate downwind hazard, but in the process, if it's not prepared appropriately, you could destroy whatever agent is that you're trying to disseminate. And of course, if you plant an explosive device, it may be detectable. And so, it could be disarmed prior to it going off. And then there are a number of various agents in which this method would work. Radiologic is one, chemical would be another. And then spraying devices, line sources or point sources, fairly effective ways to doing it, good, significant downwind hazard. So, summary, breaking devices, the downwind hazard, minimal to moderate. The most likely agent would be a chemical agent. Bursting devices, you could use all three of the most likely agents, chemical, biologic, and radiologic. But the downwind hazard here is moderate. Explosive devices, probably most likely for a radiologic agent, moderate downwind hazard. Spraying devices, chemical and biologic, and it's probably a significant downwind hazard. And as I have mentioned a couple times, it's not just the bad guys, it's not just the terrorists. This stuff is found in industry, on our streets every day. And the reality is we are much more likely to encounter them in a transportation related accident than we probably are, at least in the United States, as a result of a terrorist attack. As far as infectious diseases go, we deal with them every day in pre-hospital care and in hospital care. Um, these are not new. And the reality is, whether you're dealing with a biologic weapon or whether you're dealing with an emerging infectious disease, the general management is the same. Personal protective equipment and the hospital management, not really very different from things that we're used to dealing with on a daily basis. So, this series of presentations is going to provide responders. And while it says healthcare, again, I want to stress we're talking about all public safety responders, including healthcare responders, with the knowledge to initiate the correct medical response after identifying what that agent likely is and initiate the appropriate treatment. We're going to have you recognize the signs and symptoms of exposure, what class of agents likely caused it, select the proper treatment, and identify threats to yourself. Thank you, and we hope that you will join us for our additional modules in this series.